In many ways, I know we've had lots of communications. We've talked face to face as well as email since we met effectively. But I'm curious really a little bit around why you started Potentialisation, what's the point of it? And I know you've done the history lesson before, but I'd love to hear that history again. So what brought you here today to tell us about the latest versions? Where did it all start?
Well, I do tend to tell a little bit about a very shortened life story, because I think it gives it some context.
I think it's important.
And I think we could perhaps get to ikigai, which is a term a lot of people are talking about nowadays, which is a Japanese term of, it's when everything comes together in terms of what you're interested in, what you love doing, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you might get paid for. And
so it's the Japanese equivalent of 42, the meaning of life, the universe, yes, and everything.
Yes. So I had a phase of hearing that word quite a lot. And I think that helps me reflect back on the life story in terms of there were really two elements going on in my life most of the time up to starting this. And the first one was I went through school, and there was always an interest, as there was people do, but with an interest in computers. And I say computers, but it was actually programmable Texas Instruments calculators when I was 13 or 14. And you could put something like 100 instructions into these things. And I was always like, wow, that's really exciting, because it automates something. What I have to say is I'm not really very keen on computers, as in diving in and all the geeky details. It's not why I do it. The reason I'm interested in these things is because what you can do with them and what they achieve.
Okay.
So that led me through school. I actually did the first year of O-level computers, which would have been when I was 16, so 1982.
Yeah.
So that was when the computer O-level, or GCSE kind of, if you're younger than we are, first came in. And because I'd been quite very interested in this stuff, I think they actually aligned what was in it, because it was extremely simple if you knew even the basics. And what was a 2-hour exam took me about half an hour to finish it. Because of course they were learning the syllabus themselves, and yeah, of course I bet some schools wouldn't even have had many computers in those first days and things like that.
Well, this is pre-BBC Micro, isn't it? Which was effectively the first school's computer.
Yes, we had a whole room full of those at school. Yes, so I think that was, and there were always rumours, and this is going down a technological route. There were always rumours that if you knew the right code, what those BBC computers did was they mapped pieces of memory to physical devices, physical connections. And there were always rumours that and I don't know whether they were quite true or not, that if you wrote a bit of software that put a certain number in a certain piece of memory, you could actually set fire to the computer, because they were connected together literally. Nowadays, there's much more logical separation between the physical outputs and the software itself. But yes, that was interesting. But that continued, and I don't really need many details, but it continued in a way that I went and did a degree in software, got a job in software, because I was really interested in what can we do with computers.
Okay.
So that's the formal bit of the life story in very, very quick terms. But what I was really interested in was more philosophy stuff.
Okay, because there does seem a little bit of a incongruence there between, let's say, what you're doing nowadays with potentialization and being a software geek. The two, to my mind, are a little bit not quite common bedfellows.
They are, and or rather they're not, you're right. when I do a strengths profile or something similar like that, and I think one of them's got 50 or 60 strengths, something like that, when it says which one's your weakest on, detail is at the bottom, literally the very last one, which you wouldn't expect to be there for a programmer, which is why I said at the start, I don't actually like the mechanics of computers and the details. I'm doing it because I like what comes out the other end.
Yeah. So you're a poor programmer, but a good debugger.
Yes. So I got pretty good at software because I wanted to make it do things.
Yeah.
But in a sense, I think it made me a better programmer in that I was looking at a bit. So in terms of Myers-Briggs or Jungian stuff, forget all the letters, INFP. So high level stuff all the time.
Yeah.
So the combination of forcing myself to learn the details, but really being interested in the bigger picture, was actually quite a good combination of not being a pure programmer, but actually then going off talking to the customers as well.
Yeah.
And being that bridge between what the customers are looking for and what we actually build. So it was a bigger picture than purely being right down in the depths of the hardware or the software.
So the programming a means to an end.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Did that give you then a sort of coming from a end user perspective? So were you thinking of that human computer interface with the emphasis on the human and the computer just being that means to an end?
Yes. An important word there is Windows. Not really because of Microsoft, but the way I think about a computer should be as if it's literally a window in your house.
Yeah.
It's there and it keeps the warmth in and it keeps the cold out. But normally, unless you're a bit lazy like me, I haven't cleaned them recently, you look straight through it. Yep. Actually, I've seen somebody else talking about this and they talk about the glasses. When they're doing a good job, you forget they're there. It's only when they get dirty and you've got to have a look back and say, and then give them a clean and away you go again. So in that's the same analogy. Yeah, that's the same sense I think about computers. I want to not know it's there.
Yeah.
I want to just to use it. And the company I was working for before, we were actually creating products for conservatories. So the conservatory salesmen that are using it are not, well, it's mixed, obviously. Some people much more keen than others, but a lot of them are not necessarily very technical. And it should be the same for any computer product, that actually it's extremely easy to use, that the users can just do it without thinking most of the time. Now, that's, of course, not always possible, and things go wrong in computers, etc. But I was taught by somebody at one point to write software, and we'd spend 2 hours once or twice deciding which color something should be or exactly which word to use. And it's actually really important because, and this is what many software geeks don't necessarily get. It's like they'll say, yes, but it does what it's supposed to. And then the user comes along and they can't work out what to do. And it's like, there's two bits of software. One is if you press the right buttons, it will give you the right answer. But the other side of that is, do the users actually know which buttons to press? Is it obvious, and can they make it do that?
In psychology, there's two key things: reliability and validity in any sort of test and anything, as you know. But there's also one that isn't quite as quantifiable. That's called face validity. And face validity is, does it look like it's doing what it should do? So it almost sounds to me like you're saying that a lot of the software designers will give it reliability and validity, but don't give it face validity. So you can't see what's the point, whereas you're coming from a what's the point perspective.
Because we want to achieve an answer to the solution as easily as possible, rather than just build this abstract machine that is not necessarily easy to use. And traditionally, in fact, this is one, I've got a book over here, which is why I'm looking over to the right, called, it's actually a really good book if you're into this stuff, I'm saying that I've not read it. I've only read a bit of it, but the reviews are brilliant, and I like some of the talks I've watched on YouTube by the authors. It's called Sooner, Safer, Happier.
Sooner, safer, happier.
So I don't know how accessible it is for non-programmers, but actually, and this is a really interesting point, that I think that, and I thought for a long time, I remember talking to customers when I first started working, and at one customer's, they said in one department, we produce this great big report. It's like 100 pages, and we do it every month or something. And I said, well, what's it for? And they said, well, we don't really know. It goes to that department over there. So, of course, I go over to the other department over there after and say, what do you use this report for? And they say, well, we don't know why they keep sending it. They just send it every month. And the reason I'm saying that is because things don't get joined up sometimes.
You've just taken me back, late 1990s, when I was in what is now BAE Systems. I was part of the customer value team when we became a value-based, and part of my job was going around deploying the customer value. So I used to go to departments and basically say, why are you sending this report out? And they say, it's a real pain, John. There's 50 or 60 people on the distribution list, and it takes ages compiling it, doing it. And say, well, stop it. Don't send it. Well, what if somebody asks? I said, we'll just send them a copy if and when they ask, and we'll see how it goes. And I remember going back 9 months, year later, they'd ring me up and say, John, you'll never believe this. We've just had somebody asking for that report. And they've literally said, I've just realized I haven't seen this month's version of report. Can you send me a copy? To which we've said, well, we haven't sent one of those out for a year. So tell us what you actually want and we'll tell you the answer. So yeah, I've been there.
Absolutely. And what I realized, in fact, I realized at one point, somebody said to me, our industry is a mess. There's all this miscommunication, all these different things going on. He said, and I know most people and most industries are much better than ours. But I know when I talked to people that wanted software in other industries, they were having the same. So it's the ducks, isn't it? Paddling like crazy under the surface. It all looks pretty. And of course, we want to market that our organization's good and wonderful. But actually, and this is a fascinating point for me, is humans are really good at coping with the complexity of that chaos and making it work anyway.
Yeah.
But obviously, anything we can do to make it flow better will actually make people's lives easier, make companies more effective, all those kind of things.
You just lose the buzz then, though.
Sorry? Yes.
You lose the buzz.
Hopefully the buzz can be about achieving more and new things,
hopefully.
Not fighting problems all the time, yes. But that's why I mentioned that book, Sooner, Safer, Happier, because within software, one of the things, and this happens in life generally, is that people were specializing in particular bits of delivering software to customers. So, of course, one of them is going back to the geeky programmers that we talked about before. They'd sit in their little offices, not wanting to talk to people, and deliver exactly what they thought they'd been told. And then other people had to show the customers and get real feedback and work out what was going on. And when it was time for software to go live, it was a completely different job to install the software on a production machine and deliver it and actually have it working for the customers. So there's a fundamental conflict of interest there in terms of developers want to be left alone for a while and then produce something. And then the users want it to change and get better with feedback. But the people that deploy it want it to not change if you can help it, because their job is simply to deploy it and not have any problems. So this is where the term DevOps comes from, that you've got developers and operations need putting into teams together.
Yeah, very much so.
And it's to make it flow.
Ironically, my curve is in a couple of DevOps books, or at least one in the first and second editions of it. So around just that interaction and that feeling, because also my experience of both engineers and coders is they want to do the gold standard job rather than the job that fits the bill or that works, and they want to make it all singing, all dancing.
Yes, yes, very much so. And the trouble with that is that they're right, that they should be aiming for a gold standard, but not the one they want. Their gold standard is it's got lots and lots of features and it's really exciting and the software is really good. The gold standard they should be looking for is it's the minimum amount of software that lets the user achieve what they want. And the gold standard bit is all of those things work really well and really easily. But the programmers get bored once they've developed a feature and they want to do another one.
Yeah.
They don't want to tidy up all. Maybe it's saying too much, but I always got the feeling Microsoft was a bit like that. They're constantly producing new versions, more complicated. Excel is like a huge list of features. And I'll say Google this time rather than Apple, because Apple, I think, aim for more simplicity, but Google Docs is very much simpler. That for most people, most of the time, it does what they want.
Yeah.
You can't necessarily write a book quite as easily or write a complex legal document like you can in Word, and the format's brilliant. You've got to keep it a bit simpler. But for most people, most of the time, it's easier.
It does what it says on the tin.
And it's more accessible to get started and to do those things, and gives you other features like sharing and things that the internet now gives us. So this is going back to your question, did I have a focus on the users? Very much so. And another big reason that you want software to be as easy and obvious to use as possible is there's a very big difference between writing a bespoke piece of software for one company that wants a particular job. Because what happens is you can write it relatively quickly and put it on their machine and look over their shoulder while the user starts to try it and see what's going on. And if they click on a button and it says big error, they say, oh, I forgot about that. You're not supposed to press that button. Don't do that again. Do it like this. Go 1, 2, 3. And if you do it like that, it'll work. And of course, you're talking to one person. They're getting the love and support that you need to get them through that process to start being useful.
Yeah.
But a very big difference, if you're writing a product that will arrive on 1,000 people's desk when the update happens, if half of them get that great big error and don't know where to go, and there's nobody looking over the shoulder to help them, they put it away and don't use it again.
Yeah.
So a product piece of software, rather. I've heard somebody say, but I've no idea if we can quantify it like this, is that it's an order of magnitude harder to write a product piece of software because it needs to be much more reliable, much easier to use than it is a bespoke piece of software.
Yeah.
And I suspect it's an understatement of the level, because you've got to work very hard to clear it up, make it work brilliantly, etc. So yes,
and with the best will in the world, having sort of written training courses designed and delivered, what you think you're saying isn't always what they hear. And I've regularly said the communication is not what you say, it's what they hear.
Yes.
And so I can understand that.
I also remember talking to a user remotely once that they were struggling with something, and they said, and this has just appeared. And actually, it had been on the desktop for months. They'd just not looked at it. So many people are very narrowly focused on what they're trying to achieve. And they're trying to, because they don't like technology, ignore as much as possible. So when things change, it's really disruptive. And then it's like some of the cartoons you see, press any key to continue.
Yeah.
And they're on the support line saying, I'm looking everywhere, but I can't find the any key. And it's very different interpretations.
Very different. Impact intent, a classic,
Yes, so that's very much been a focus for me. But another reason I like the simplicity is because I'm lazy. I want software that just works, because I want to focus on the problem domain, not how to use the software.
Yeah.
And that's partly why I'm so keen. And of course, I don't want lots of support calls when we write software. I want people to be getting on and using it, getting the benefit of it. So yes, that's my background in software.
Interesting. So how did that sort of focus on people in software or people using software for an end result. How did that lead to the potentialization and that philosophical? You touched on, you were also interested in philosophy. So tell me about the marriage there then.
It wasn't a marriage formally till a year or two ago. Like two different bits of the world for me. So even as a teenager, I remember asking myself the question, well, why does it feel as though I'm in my head? We've actually got a perspective that we experience life as though we're physically behind our eyes and those kind of things.
There's a Buddhist book by a British Army major, I think from the 1920s, that I read back at the time I'm talking about, late 90s. And it's called something like I Have No Head. It's that concept.
Yes, it's called On Having No Head.
Right. Yeah, fascinating.
Douglas Harding, I think his name is.
Can't remember the name.
Yes.
I remember my boss at the time, I bought him a copy when I left, or when he left the team I was in. Stunning book.
Yes. I know somebody that met him that actually saw him somewhere. He lived in the Midlands, I think, somewhere. I'm not sure exactly, but he did exercises, and it was a little, not to be rude about it, but he had crude experiments, like you'd get a kitchen roll, like the empty tube, and look down the tube. But the basic idea was you can do this on different levels, but at the very simplest level, it was simply recognizing that most of the time, you don't actually see your own head. You're looking into the world and you see the rest of the world. And you just suppose and assume without even thinking most of the time that your own head is there.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to get philosophical. It's about perspectives.
It is.
And how people see it from different angles and things like that.
It will be interesting to talk to him now in the world of Zoom, because the one thing I hate is seeing my picture just next to yours on here and watching myself. And I really struggle with that because I have no head. Yes.
And there it is, or at least, but even then it's a picture of it.
Yeah, nice one. I like that. It's a construct.
And sometimes it's reversed and backwards, and sometimes we notice and sometimes we don't. And yes, so it was that curiosity about the nature of things that I explored in various ways over the years. But without going into that, I was saying this as the quick version of the life story. We're getting into all sorts of things, but I still find it fascinating, even looking back in terms of how it all happened. But I went through various different things and even looked at spiritual teachers a bit and whatever, but without ever really committing to anything in great depth and getting drawn in and saying that's the answer. It was like, there's a lot of interesting things out there. And I think some really good philosophers talk about this kind of stuff nowadays, because I'll just dip into psychology and philosophy a tiny bit, but I've been listening to somebody called Jon Twigge quite a lot, who's a professor. I'm saying professor, I think he's a assistant professor, whatever they call them at universities, and he talks about 4 different kinds of knowing. And I can't remember all of them, but the first one is the academic. The ideas, we've got a proposal, you can say, look, there's a theory and I can test it in the real world like scientists do. And most of education in our world, in the formal places, focus very much on that. It's ideas and thoughts that we can test, measure, mathematics, physics, all that kind of knowledge about the world, but it's in an abstract sense.
And Karl Popper's famous for basically talking about, for anything to be valid, it has to be falsifiable.
Yes.
Within.
Yes. The second one he talks about is actually and I forget the exact words, it's being engaged in the world and physically doing things. So learning to ride a bike, you learn a real skill and you fall off, you hurt yourself, you get back on. And if you get wobbly, you feel it. You cannot describe in that original academic way to somebody how to ride a bike. So it's got a massive gap between what you can describe in that academic sense and what we actually experience in the world day to day, ongoing basis. So it's
Yeah.
like we've actually missed huge areas in modern society of how people exist and relate to the world.
And that's one of the, I'll use the word classic, but it's a bit like the nature-nurture debate. It's one of the classic issues in psychology, that academic versus practitioner, or the theory versus the practical dilemma. And people like Ebbinghaus, working in the late 19th, probably early 20th century, totally in an operation, in a laboratory, without taking it out into the real world, in inverted commas. So yeah, it's a fascinating topic area.
And this is actually one of the things that for me has been really important about what we're trying to achieve, is that my experience of networking around all of this area and different things, association of business psychology, had a little bit of coaching at one point with a psychologist who was more in depth and academic, and all sorts of different people, is that it appears to me that there seems to be quite a divide between these two camps. And the academics talk about proof and research and verifiability and all sorts of things. So if I say Myers-Briggs to somebody that's very formal, the response I often get back is, well, you do know there's not a lot of evidence for that stuff, don't you? But if I then go and talk to some on-the-ground business coaches, they say, yeah, but we're never going to get a dozen directors out of or senior managers out of a big company to do a 200-point questionnaire. And also, it's like they want some real results quickly and easily that works and makes a difference.
Face validity again.
Yes. So we can often get that face validity in a business, even if the underlying methodology is not, and I don't know the numbers, 100% formally validated. But it doesn't matter. People learn. So, and another aspect of that for me is that on both sides of that world, I've spoken to people when they're in a company that says, well, ours is the best. Ours does everything. You don't want to use somebody else's methods because it's wrong like this, it's wrong like... And my view of all of these is, well, I think we need some kind of synergy of mix of all of the best, because we're really missing out. In fact, another aspect of that is, if you've got a small company that's got very good methods and they're helping some businesses and they're charging quite a lot of money in terms of trying to be good, surviving and having a viable business, but they tend to get little worlds, eco worlds of their customers and the people they relate to, and it might be quite a few thousand people. But that's not taking some of those best methods out to millions of people that might benefit from them. So I think that mixture of we're the best and we have to survive financially actually restricts how much, and in fact, I think you used a term when we were talking before about giving psychology away.
George Miller. Yeah.
How do we effectively get as much psychology, and by that, and another word I like, I think I've said it before to you, that somebody else came up with, is personology. How do we get as much, or another way of saying that might be holistically view of an individual?
Yeah.
Across Viveki's all those different kinds of knowing. Another one was about relationships. How do we know our status hierarchies, our relationships to other people in the world? That's not just about riding a bike, that's an interactive thing between different people.
And it's a fluid thing for me, as you know, I'm a constructivist. It's a fluid thing for me, is that because my relationship with you is different to my relationship with the boss. It's different to my relationship with the guy who drew the cartoon of me. And those relationships change and are fluid over time as well. So it's all about that almost relativity of what we're doing, where we're doing it, when we're doing it.
And that can be really, well, it is really important to people. But if we think of teenagers that are out with their friends or at school, they don't want the parents coming into those relationships because they're very different worlds.
Yeah. And
it's like to be seen in one role with people from another role where you relate to those very differently. It's like and to me, this is really healthy that we're learning new roles.
Yeah.
But of course,
I think also part of that for me is around, as we learn those new roles, we also help educate the people in those different roles, that there are different roles. So when I've been into businesses doing training, consulting, coaching, whatever it might be, and we've talked about A and other, and they've said things, and I've said, that's not been my experience, but of course I have a different relationship with them. And you can see the other person then going, I've not thought about that type. And they were just seeing them one-dimensionally rather than seeing them multidimensionally.
Yes, it reminds me of something from a long time ago when talking to a customer. And in this particular case, quite a lot of years ago now, we would talk to a manufacturer of something, but we would also talk to their customers. And both sides would say not unpleasant, but critical things, shall we say, because they're on opposite sides of a business relationship. There's always going to be like, we'd like them to be better at this, that, or the other. And they would tell us as an independent some of those criticisms. And it's like there's a power structure going on between the different areas.
Yeah.
And they're playing politics because of the commercial elements, and everybody needs to make a profit.
I think sometimes it's not even as simple, complex as that. One thing's, again, I've done in the past when I've had customers and suppliers or a supply chain in the room and I'm doing workshops with them, is to get each party to write down what they think the other party's top 5 needs, wants are. And rarely do I get one match out of the 10. Normally all 5 are totally different. Both are right, but no different, no similarity and overlap. And I've done it with multiples and rarely get one from any of them. So it's a fascinating little exercise, that, just to help break down those barriers.
Yes, and intuitively, because I've not tried to break those barriers, not been through that experience with businesses and how you do that, but intuitively I would have thought, and I think it seems obvious to me, that if you can break those barriers down, you're going to start having a much more productive relationship.
Totally.
Because otherwise you're pulling in different directions.
Yeah.
And it's got to be based on fear that we think they're trying to make more profit out of us at our expense. When actually, if we can move to a cooperative world, and I think this is one of the things that's shifting in the world generally, is more organizations are moving towards cooperative relationships as opposed to competitive relationships.
Yeah.
Of course, you have to be really careful. We even get into monopolies and who's allowed to talk to who about what and for what reasons, like if you've got big monopolies or all sorts of things. But generally, if organizations to work together, you're going to become more effective.
Yeah, and cooperation always wins in the long term. I'm trying to remember the name of it's a double-barreled name for sort of looking at that competitive cooperative that ends up with 5 areas, with the middle one being cooperation. Or I used to put the cooperation in the middle one rather than the conflict in the negotiation style. And came across a story years ago that really hit home for me again. And it's 2 people come to me, I've got 2 oranges, and both of them say, John, can I have an orange? I really want an orange, can I have one? And the win-win, or the win-lose, is I give both to one and none to the other. The compromise is I give them 1 each. But the cooperative one is I say to one, what do you want it for? and they say, well, I'm really dry, I could do with some vitamin C, so I want to squeeze them, I want to drink the juice. Say to the other, what do you want yours for? I love making marmalade, and I want them to get the rind and the peel to make some really good shredded marmalade. Just love it. So the actual collaborative answer is to give both of them to one to squeeze the juice, to then give to the other, so they both actually get what they want, and there's no lose-lose, no win-lose. It's a total pure win-win. And that sort of concept of understand why they want it will then help you deliver what they want and need, rather than coming up with a half-cocked answer that suits nobody fully.
Yes, a couple of things from that is, one is it takes me back to the software days of working in a company for customers. But the other one is a Google survey. But the customer one is, there's different kinds of customers, and some of them will explain what they're trying to do. But others that are, and it's an example of a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
That they know a little bit about software, and they will tell you what they want you to do or what they want the software to do. But they haven't got the experience of designing software. So what they're giving you is quite a patchwork of various ideas that don't really fit together in a good software design. But also, if there are other departments in their organization, won't necessarily make sense for the other department because of the language and all sorts of different things. So it took me a while, and I think most programmers, junior programmers, make this mistake, is they do what they're told. And what you really need to do is listen. And if they're not telling you why, you must ask why. What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And then you can design software to achieve what they're looking for, rather than implement what they're telling you they think they need. Which is not always the same thing with software, or it gives you a bad design that's then hard to maintain.
And lesson I've learned to my pain and agony in various times, sometimes by me doing it wrong, other times by people not quite being as open as they should have been with what they wanted. I mean, you're right, it's fundamental. So what do you want it to do? How will you know it's done it? One of the quotes I started using going back when I was doing performance management type of training is, measure what's important, don't make the measure important. And too often we make measure important, not the output.
And that takes us back to the window, which you're looking for. You're looking to see through it.
You're
not at looking for the speck of the window. And I quite
like that. But as you know, my footer, it's my job to make windows where there was once walls. So I do like your analogy of this little box there. And luckily my window's straight there, so I can see out into my back garden. So I've got a window in front of a window.
I'm also remembering where I'm thinking about this glasses quote as well. And it's a different level, actually, that it's somebody talking about most of the time, and it takes us a little bit more to psychology, is when we've got our glasses on, we forget they're there. But they do change what we can see, because they're tinted or they're dirty or they're... What we need to do is sometimes take them off and have a look and say, oh, look, the world's different.
Well, let's go back to Covey then. His seventh habit, sharpening the saw.
Yes,
sometimes
absolutely.
We've got to clean the glasses.
Cleaning the glasses, yes. And if we take this into a psychology frame, the glasses and what they're doing, which is my bias looking out into the world, can be very complex. So it's not just, in this case, cleaning the glasses, it's understanding the nature of glasses.
And there's a lens theory within psychology. I think I first came across it in NLP, but we look through the differing lenses that then help us see what we expect to see, what we want to see, not necessarily what's there. And it goes back to the map is not the territory.
Yes. But it's fascinating because as humans, we have to have a map. because that's how we function in the world, by abstracting
Mm.
and understanding the higher level concepts. So the trick is, and it's really difficult because most of the time our lens and our biases and our filters are under the surface.
Yeah.
The trick is to recognize when to have triggers or something to say, maybe you're having a conversation with somebody and then they answer you in a way you're not expecting.
Mm.
The thing is not to just repeat it louder.
Yeah.
Not to be mean, but I once saw my mum do that in a cafe in France.
Yeah. It's the classic Brit abroad.
That doesn't help.
No.
But to notice that there's something not quite right, and it might be you need to clean your glasses, or it might be you need a different kind of glasses, or you need something else. So that we need to be able to function in a way. In fact, it's when I listen to people talking about unconscious bias and how it's quite bad to be biased in this way. It's more complex than that for me, that we have to have unconscious bias to function. So one of my unconscious biases is if food smells bad, I'm not going to eat it. If the road is very busy, I'm not going to run across it and risk getting run over. So I've got lots of biases, and I've learned them throughout my life to function effectively. Of course, this gets us into trauma and childhood stuff, that if we've lived in ways that have created what for most people would be dysfunctional, but actually were really functional to cope with those situations, the unconscious biases are going to be less functional in our modern world. So it's useful if we can look back at them and try and adjust.
Totally. And we're dropping back into constructivist territory here with some of Kelly's sort of thinking and thoughts around we're not the victims of our biography, so we can make different decisions, we can change what we do, how we respond and react, but we've got to consciously make that decision. The other thing that Kelly talked about was the fact that we make the best choices that we can with the information and the wherewithal that we have. So while you may not agree with my choice, for me, that's the best choice I could make, because I didn't know what you know to make you a bit dubious about it. So it's always that interplay between our experience and anticipating the future based on our past experiences and choosing courses of action that are more or less effective. And
this has taken us away from how I quite got here with the philosophy, but we're diving into some of the things. But this is one of the things that struck me as really interesting, even exciting, because I'd hear somebody talking about stage development models, and that's about shifting worldviews. But I'd also be hearing people talk about emotional intelligence and personality traits. And again, often I'd hear the people that were talking about these things saying this is the most important bit. But actually, to me, it's like, surely they must all have a component of what I am. And it's actually by looking at this in a bigger way that we can really start to understand. Because if I'm blocked in one particular way, it might be stopping something else happening. Or by combining strengths in all of them, I'm going to be more effective overall. I think this is where we perhaps get into where those academic psychologists are measuring all sorts of things, or where schools in general, scientifically based, etc., are missing some other things in terms of we don't get taught self-awareness at school and mindfulness. But actually, I think if you get to the root of what mindfulness is about, and again, this is a bit of a pet thing for me, and mindfulness should not be about teaching our employees to be able to breathe a bit better, to stay calm, so we can carry on abusing them and putting them in stressful situations. That's not what mindfulness was really intended for. That's it, the capitalist machine abusing and say, oh, that's a useful tool. I can keep my staff working hard all the time for longer without getting into trouble and all sorts of things. What mindfulness is really about is simply noticing what's going on in yourself.
And we're fringing here, of course, on the interview that Potentialisation did with Robin Hills on resilience and the dark side of resilience, where the danger is it becomes an excuse just to dump more onto people and say it's good for your resilience.
Yes.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Yeah, right.
And then we can take that and say, actually, if you do mindfulness on its own and it's just noticing your breathing and it's doing all these things, and you might notice some things that you're doing, and it's really useful. But actually, if we can then study or learn a little bit about the theory of mind in terms of abstraction and all sorts of different things, we can use those academic ideas, and I don't mean pure academic, I mean thoughts, theories, how we learn all of this stuff in an academic way can actually give us a framework to say, I can use mindfulness more effectively because I can understand what's going on when there's an unconscious bias or when a particular emotion arises or all those different things. So which suggests that actually having a more rounded view of ourselves in terms of personality trait, emotional intelligence, skills, the whole holistic picture of ourselves is going to help us be more effective. And that's not to say that everybody's going to go and research psychology and learn in depth about all these different methods, but just even a basic awareness of what's going on can be useful.
Yeah, I would agree. Within everything really, and the mindfulness, it's about awareness focus. For me, and it's about just being aware of what there is, so you can then explore why you've reacted, those triggers, what does that feeling mean, and why did it happen?
Yes, and I think listening to Robin that you were talking about before, about because he covers emotional intelligence, resilience in particular, but emotional intelligence at its root level is just an awareness of our own self and emotions and reactions. Which also takes me to what Darren Stevens is doing with his, because he talks about having the capacity to choose what your reaction is. Which it's kind of emotional intelligence, but emotional intelligence tends to talk about our emotions and how we react. But it's actually much wider than that. It's the same principle. That even it might be ideas, even if we're not feeling emotional, we might say, oh, I don't believe that. But actually, it's like, why do I not believe that? Am I biased in the information I've had in the past? Do I need to look into it a bit more depth, or are other opinions useful in these areas?
And is it a threat? And everything.
So it might be watching the news and things like that. Why do I believe? Obviously, vaccinations is a big topic at the moment. And if we look at the possible extremes of views, my view would be both sides have got elements of truth in them. If we're going to get very extreme at one end, why would one person be able to do something that makes it more likely that my grandma might die? That's unforgivable. If you were the person that didn't wear the mask and gave it to my grandma and then she died, that's really bad. But there's truth on the other side. Why should I put myself at risk taking a vaccine that might give me side effects and hurt me for other people? So this is that dynamic, and that's really important, that we've all got a belief in ourselves and we're independent, we have our choices, we're not living in a dictatorship, and we've got very strong views on and very strong supportive arguments on both sides.
And it's that moral dilemma that comes out of philosophy, isn't it? Do I send a train down track A that kills one person, or track B that kills 100? Which do you choose?
Yes, and I was watching something many years ago. Somebody said it's wrong to turn off the life support of somebody that's very ill because it's playing God. You're choosing life and death. But my first response to that, from a slightly bigger perspective, is: was it not wrong to turn it on in the first place?
Because you're playing God.
because you're playing God. And
yeah, that was my immediate reaction there to that, John, as well.
yes. So it's not a judgment, because those people have looked, and it's a very, very human thing to want to save lives. And that's incredibly important. It's a massive part of what we are, to have children, to carry on the species. But most of what's going on is actually unconscious for most people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the iceberg theory model, isn't it?
And if you've learned different moral rules, and to me, moral rules they're frameworks for social cohesion. This is how we live. And somebody, if you go back to a tribe in the Amazon or wherever, maybe 1,000 years ago, if somebody breaks the rules, they're endangering the tribe's survival. So you throw them out, literally, if it's extreme. Yeah. We live in a very different world now, where if somebody's eccentric, well, they can happily live in their own house and they're not hurting anybody, because nobody's going to die necessarily, unless it's extremely extreme. That they start threatening people or whatever. So the world's very different. But all these, I mean, you could say that we've evolved as humans, as animals, to survive. Intellectually, our brains have raced ahead and become very sophisticated in the models of, but we've still got the emotional brains going on and living in a world that was much more primitive.
Yeah, flight or fight.
It's an interesting mixture that we live in at the moment. And I think what we really need is, and this is a fundamental part of potentialization, is to become more conscious of how we operate in the world. That, in fact, that's a key part of what led up to potentialization for me over the last few years, as I thought about it and planned it, is that what we've done with science is we get very good, as you said earlier, testability. We've got a possibility or an idea, and we try it and we test it, and it's true or not. That basic principle was something I was taught quite a few years ago, 10 years ago or whatever, that advertising now does. They call it split testing. So what they do is, on a web page, you have two versions, and these web pages are trying to sell something. And you can literally put 1,000 people through that one and 1,000 people through that one, and then see out of the 1,000 on both sides what percentage go through to the next stage of that selling process. Yeah. Really simple and really obvious. Yeah. But there's an underlying problem, quotes problem, with that. I'm saying it's a problem because obviously it's functional, it's helping you sell something. The danger is that what that's interacting with, I learned a little bit about multi-level marketing. Somebody I knew was getting into it, and I looked into it a little bit, and I watched a talk by somebody, and this person said, what percentage do you think of a decision is logical and factual and everything else, and how much do you think is an emotional decision? And he asked the audience and got various answers. And of course, there's various, the people that are more detail oriented might say, oh, it's 90%. And then maybe there might be a bit of emotion in it. And some of the other people say, well, actually, I think it's more, it might even be half or more emotional. And he said, no, it's 100% emotional. People want something. And then, as you'll know from psychology, back justify with the facts. They get the confirmation bias, all these different biases as to reasons why they can justify why they wanted that nice new car in the first place. Yeah.
We buy emotionally and justify logically.
I need it because the customers will respect me then if I've got a fancy car. Yeah. So what's happening with this split testing is we're actually relating to somebody emotionally. So science over time, and this happens with politics and the media, all the time they're fine-tuning the message for an emotional hit to get the sale. Yeah. But it's got so good that I started to think, when I looked at it in some detail, is we've got to the point where the science has overtaken the humanity. we'll sell things to people that they don't need, that might even at the extreme put them in debt, that will threaten their mental health in all sorts of ways. And the consequences, and this is what they've been talking about with Facebook recently as well, is that the focus was on profit, even when they knew that it was damaging people.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got to the point as a society where we need to put much more thought and effort. And I think the long-term solution is education, that both sides of that equation, people that sell things are responsible, and people that buy things have got more appreciation of it if they might be being manipulated. So in the long term, it's education, but in the short term, we have to have some regulation.
Yeah.
To say, look, you can't get that extreme.
Yeah.
That you're manipulating people to such an extent that it's damaging their lives.
Well, we saw that in the 90s with the double glazing, hard sell philosophy, which the pendulum swung the other way and did a lot of damage to things like NLP. That was one of the favorite tactics and tools. And in its own right, NLP can help. It's people that abuse it, but too often we don't blame the abuser, we blame the tool that they use to abuse. And you're right, I think the pendulum will swing back over time, I'm sure. I am optimistic.
And I think in terms of that in particular, I might say that actually I'd take a step back even further than that, because it's not the individual abuser, it's the system and the training and it's that whole thing, and they don't quite realize how much it's become manipulative.
Yeah.
A really nice word I like by somebody called Zach Stein is he uses a word, because he's very much into what should education look like, and he's got a concept that he calls teacherly. So if I say to somebody, you must make me a cup of tea, otherwise I'll be really upset with you, you're actually telling somebody what to do.
Yeah.
And it might be against their will or whatever else. So there's actually a control level. And we don't want that in education. We don't want to be telling people what to do. What we want to do is, and the reason I'm talking about telling people what to do is that if we take very young children, they don't understand the whole world. So we have to tell them what to do to some extent for their benefit. And he calls that being teacherly. So we are the teacher, we give them a framework, but the point is not to get myself a cup of tea without doing it myself. The point of view is for the child to grow to the point where they can make their decisions for themselves later, when they've got that capacity.
Yeah.
But that takes a lot of wisdom to get the balance right, and to know when it's really teacherly, as in you're doing it for their benefit, versus it's actually telling people what to do. And in fact, this is one of the things, again, from a potentialization point of view, is thinking about how societies work, is that parents and societies teach young children how to behave for their benefit. Hold on to your brother's hand, don't leave him behind, because there's a tiger around and we don't want him to be eaten. So make sure, and that will come with a big emotional charge. This is really important. We're living in a tribe, and our society, our tribe depends on this. So these messages get built in, and we learn all the unconscious biases about what's right and wrong and how we should behave. So that's right. But if I'm in a school and I'm teaching children, we now live in a really complex world. So let's take an issue where there are very, very different views with elements, let's say, without judging what's right. Let's say we're talking about abortion, where we've got the unborn baby's rights versus the mother's rights the rest of her life, and it's complex. If you have a school teacher that puts one of those views forward very strongly, is that now right? Might have been right 500 years ago, when in a small town we're trying to survive and we've got these rules. But when we're actually moving into a world in the next, we're there now, but it's going to get even more so. We're getting into a world where where the world is now and what it will be like in 20 years' time is going to be very different.
Very different. The shades of grey.
So, yes.
It also links into something that I've thought for a long time around how we educate and how we bring up and that context. But we say to children, don't touch the oven, it's hot. But most of the time it isn't. But we still tell them not to touch it. So they touch it, feel it's cold. We immediately become liars. It then breeds distrust. It then encourages them to challenge back. And it's about giving them the because for me, the with them, the because. Don't touch that oven when that's illuminated or when that's bright because it's hot. Then, and we give them mixed messages that doesn't help them acculturalize and become a good member, whatever that means, of society, whatever that means.
And this is really fascinating for me, listening to various people, philosophers, teachers about this kind of stuff is, I really strongly agree with what you're saying, that we need to give people as much context as possible for understanding. But when my child is 2 years old, they don't understand those concepts. So what I've got to do is give them some teacherly instructions, don't touch the oven. But I need the wisdom to recognize when they've got old enough to start understanding what's going on and evolve that message. Which is a classic example of this, to be not quite sure what the right word would be, fantasy or whatever, is Father Christmas has bought you your presents. It's a nice story, but when do you then tell them the truth? And I remember somebody telling me that they were heartbroken when they found out at school because all their friends told them it wasn't true, and they then literally, just described a minute ago, lost trust with the parents. How do we navigate through that? Because we literally cannot explain the mechanics of being burnt and going to a hospital to a 2-year-old properly. We can do, and how do we navigate? And then how do we put that into education? Because one of the classic examples that somebody was talking about on one of these things was that at O level, excuse me being old again, GCSE or whatever level nowadays, or whatever they're going to change it into, we learn some physics and we learn that atoms are made up of electrons that fly around.
Do I detect the smell of quantum theory coming up here?
But of course, it's simply not true.
No, totally untrue.
But the model kind of works. To a point, and it's useful. And what we do is when they get to university and start doing the quantum physics, we say, well, of course, we all know that's not really true. If you're really interested in physics and you've got to start doing lots more complex stuff of you don't know where it is at the same time as how fast it's going, and you've got a particle goes through both slots at the same times, and all sorts of wacky stuff starts coming out. I read Feynman's book, QED, which is fascinating if you're a little bit interested in the physics. And light doesn't travel in straight lines at all. It just probably does. Which means that all the particles of light sort of whizzed around all over the place on average, and I might be getting the details wrong, but on average, they appear to have gone in a straight line. And all sorts of things, and particles that go backwards in time, and all sorts of weird stuff starts coming out.
I think there's some fascinating things coming out of quantum physics. Don't understand it at all, but there's some fascinating things coming out.
But the key point behind all of this for me is that we need a radical shift in education from rules-based things where if A, you do B, to the skills to understand myself, the rules that I've seen other people following, but the critical thinking to look underneath when I need to say, well, when might that break down? And how do I evolve new rules when I need to? And all sorts of self-awareness and when I might be biased and all sorts of things. Because as I say, in 20 years' time, if I've learnt the rules for how I do a particular skill in a particular job, and in 20 years that job doesn't exist anymore, I've now got a problem. So
are we coming back to the concept of fuzzy logic again, and fuzzy programming, and just that almost coding in question marks, grey areas, and making the coding slightly less A equals B equals C every time.
Yes. I haven't heard much about fuzzy logic for a long time.
No, neither have I, but it just suddenly sprung to my mind when you were talking then.
Yes. The concept of fuzzy logic, obviously, is it's mathematical and it's to do with computers and those kinds of things. But if you widen that, yes, absolutely. If you look at Ken Wilber, one of the things he talks about as people move to new levels is that you must transcend. And if I try and expand slightly, because he just literally says transcend and include. I say he only says that. There's then a whole book behind it. but the phrase transcend and include.
Yeah.
But transcend me in the terms of go beyond my own simpler views of how I looked at the world and include new views. Sorry, move to new ones, but also include part of what wasn't truth in the level below. So we're not throwing it away completely, we reinterpret things.
Yeah.
But one of the issues is we do tend to reject what's below.
Yeah.
But the shift towards more complex views can actually say, as I said earlier about abortion, that there's truth in both sides of the argument to some extent. And in that sense, we can't say one side is right and the other is wrong completely. We can say there's elements of truth in both.
Yeah. As that great social philosopher from the 60s and 70s, Johnny Cash, what is truth?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
So how did that then link into the birth of potentialization? Because there's a myriad of really fascinating tentacles there. It's sort of a multi-tentacled octopus, or it's a nest of octopi. How did that then give you the concept of potentialization? I can see now the sort of genesis of it with what you've just been talking about, education. So what was the gestation?
It's a long story, and some of the things we've just talked about are perhaps things that have evolved in my mind, clarified even more recently. So it's not necessarily true to say that all of that was there and then potentialization was born.
But it fits with what we're just talking about, doesn't it? About integrating, your include, I would use integrate personally, around that transcend and include, which is just what you're doing with potentialization. So you're walking the talk.
One of the key things for me was I discovered, let's say, a spiritual path. And this is one of the things that some of these philosophers talk about, is that, and it doesn't have to be religion or ghosts or that kind of stuff. It's spiritual in the sense of a knowing of ourselves and how we can be good, as in live in better states in the world. So rather than being in a hell of fear and doubt, if we're in the mafia and we're low down, we're worried about literally the power and how, do we upset the boss, and to actually living in a tranquil society where, reminds me, I was going to say about that Google survey, that they did a big survey years ago, and they said they were a lady that was very much involved, I watched her talk, said they were somewhat surprised, not surprised that the number one item was in the list at all, but that it was the first item. The most important thing is emotional security. And that's the freedom to be able to discuss and talk without fear that you'll be ridiculed, etc., etc. So if we live in a world where we can all talk to each other and we've got trust, etc., we can live it in a much more satisfactory life. And it gets better, and there's levels of that. So by spiritual in that sense, it's almost humanness or expanding,
self-actualization type of moving up to, because you just reminded me of Maslow's hierarchy, where safety in the broadest sense is a must at the bottom of the pyramid, and then sort of self-actualization is at the top of that pyramid as a ambition to drop into and drop out of, as and when.
So there's been an unfolding of awareness of lots of these things over lots of years. I have to say, as a very, very amateur psychologist, because I don't know a lot of the formal terms and things and all that kind of stuff, and also a very amateur philosophy as well, because I know some of the names, but get me to explain in detail all the different philosophies and all sorts, and I'm lost very quickly, unlike some of these academics. But one of the things that struck me is that I discovered a spiritual path. I'm not going to get into what or whatever, and it was really interesting. As I say, it was only ever dipping a toe in it that this is really fascinating, because there's all sorts of things going on in the world that our own subjective experiences are quite complex, shall we say, without getting into too much details. And I really liked some elements of this path. So I started talking about it to other people, because it's one of the things, people have some kind of discovery, and it's like, wow, look what I found. And it's like, you start telling other people.
Yeah.
Whether it's a new cake in Sainsbury's or whatever it is, it's like, this is really good. Or a film even, you recommend things. But what I discovered, of course, is that there's a huge variety in the responses. Most people not interested. I've got my own way. I've got my own favourite from Aldi or whatever it might be. And that, for me, was the recognition of around that and then beyond, that everybody's got their own path and their own way of finding their truth and their life and all these kind of things. But all of them, hopefully, involve learning, growing, as you say, moving up Maslow's hierarchy. Excuse me, to let's say, in very simple terms, without getting into details, a better life for them and other people. So what was me discovering something which I thought was really useful, and then naively thinking, well, this is going to be great for lots of people. Actually, it's more complex. And that was a thought process that evolved. That led to discovering spiral dynamics about 20 years ago. Somebody recommended the book Spiral Dynamics. The Spiral Dynamics book is very dry. It's a little bit academic, the original one. So I picked it up, read a few pages, maybe it was a third of the book or something like that, and then gave up. It didn't resonate. But it must have been a couple of years later, and I don't know what the trigger was or whatever it was. Memory's terrible going back, but time to have another look. And I read the whole lot, and it's like, wow, this makes so much sense. In very simple terms, the spiral dynamics levels are, it's a meta level. They call them V-memes. So what's underlying those levels is it appears in the world that there are ways in which societies and the individuals within them to make up those societies can organize themselves in coherent ways. And as we move up through the levels, not trying to say it's better, it's about what's appropriate for the society you find yourself in. We move to higher levels of complexity. So obviously a tribe in the Amazon might have huge skills in terms of how do you make a fire, how do you skin a rabbit, all these that we wouldn't have. But in terms of the organization of the social structure, it's quite simple. Nowadays, we jump in a car, we can go to the bank, we can do all these things, we can pay money. We've got a really complex social structure. So we're moving to more levels of complexity. And it's like, wow, this explains so much. It kind of explains politics. All we've got is different ways of looking at the world that people have learned when they were young, not Carl Jung, because it's all related, of course, that they all make sense in the context in which they were born. So a Muslim society, a Christian society, whatever it might be, all made sense in terms of survival for that group of people and prospering to make something work. In a related way, not to suggest that those societies are right or wrong, it's all about what's appropriate. In the same way as an individual living in a family that's not the most constructive, shall we say, has to learn how to behave and survive in that more difficult situation than somebody that's quite lucky.
And it's about adapting then to different situations when you are out of that environment, and that skill set no longer helps you be the most effective you can be.
So people go through shifts like going to university. It's like that's suddenly a very different world from a small school in a small town.
Yeah.
And in fact, this relates to the change curve of your work, that some people are going to be very long way along the change curve and open to change and love university. Wow, why didn't I come here before? The majority will sit more in the middle and take time to adjust, and there'll be a bit of fear, etc. And there'll be a smaller number of people that say, I'm going home. I'm going to go and work for the family business. I don't like this big world.
Yeah.
And it's what's appropriate.
Yeah. And I've stopped using words like better and started using more or less effective.
Yes.
And usually, hopefully, try to use the more effectives, because I've just found that words like better are just so judgmental, but so meaningless. And when people say to me, I want to be better, I say, better than what? A slug?
Yes.
And it's, so yeah, I think the context is really important, as you know,
yes,
for the decisions that we make.
And I think that I'd use another word as well. And in some respects, I think it's better. In other respects, I think it's worse. Pardon me using the words I'm not supposed to use.
I'll forgive you this time, John.
And I'd use the word appropriate.
Yeah, which you've used a lot. Yeah.
To be effective in a particular situation.
Yeah.
The reason I'm saying is it's not quite as good in other respects is it might imply a judgment of
who defines what's appropriate.
Yes, that's not appropriate, that kind of stuff. Yes, absolutely. So,
but it's still better than better.
Yes, yes. So it's appropriate for that context. Now, in fact, this is what we've produced a film for potentialization, which we'll put out at some point as we get a bit closer. And this is very much the message behind that film.
Excellent.
As we grow up as a child and go through whatever we go through, and then we learn new rules, whether it be quantum physics when we'd learn classic physics behind, or we actually learn that relationships are more complicated than, and then we can get into attachment theory and all sorts of things, and Freudian ego and Maslow's, all those kind of things. We're learning new sets of rules and adapting. That process, I was going to say, tends to be unconscious, but of course in the moment it's not unconscious. We go to university and we feel horrible. I'm lonely. It's very, very conscious. But we evolve and we build a new pattern, a new way of looking at the world, and we then forget that we went through that difficult growth. So it's unconscious in the sense that we've now got a new worldview and we forget we used to have different ones. So when we go to a nursery and we take toys off the other children, and it's all about aggression and who can get what and etc. The terrible twos, which hopefully most people grow out of and they don't grow into bullies. As a teenager, they start thinking, oh, the planet's important and I want to save the world and be nice to everybody. They don't remember being 2 or 3 and bullying their friends. Because they've grown. And it doesn't make sense. It's not that original self at 2 or 3 defines the end you. It's part of a process of growth, etc.
And I think it goes back to your inclusion as well, because part of that desire to win is what potentially is needed with the desire then to become an ecological warrior and the desire to save the planet type. So one of the things I find I do a lot of in the coaching is help people recognize where they've had the skills and stopped using them, to reintroduce them back into some of those skills that will help them in the current situation. And it's not about, I've left that behind now, that's no longer important. It's that work then. What do I need to change to help me now to do what I need to do?
Yes, and again, the word appropriate for me is really useful, because as we're growing up and we get to nursery school and we play our power politics at the various levels, it's actually really important part of that growing up and maturing into an older world to believe in yourself.
Very much so.
And then this is more a Freudian ego, and I don't know the details, but it's identifying with myself and separating from mum, maybe dad, attachment theory kind of stuff. And if that goes wrong and there isn't a healthy belief in yourself, this can be really difficult in all sorts of relationships later on.
Yeah.
But of course, if it's too bad the other way and you actually become a bully, that's dangerous as well. So it's always about the balance of how we find ourselves in life. And of course, if there are any remnants of that, that's perhaps where we get back to the mindfulness and the coaches to help us to understand how we got to where we're at and to evolve to be even better.
And I suppose we're fringing there on really journaling and that reflexive practice of, so why did that trigger me in the way it triggered me? What's the implication? What do I need to do differently to get a more effective response to that trigger?
Which raises the question for me is, why have I seen at least 3 or 4 people talk about how journaling is very good, and I've made a note to self, do some journaling, and it's never happened. It's like we have these ways of avoiding things and thinking, oh, I don't need this or that or the other. And so actually, I did think many years ago, I watched a program about a charity that worked with people. They'd got a courtyard of houses, small houses, and it was something like a dozen houses, and then they'd got an office, and you could literally move into one of the houses, and it would help like a young mum with children that didn't know how to manage the money because they'd never learned at school how to manage the bills and do all the practical skills. It's like, come here, we'll work with you. And I thought about that. I thought, I think we need coaching for everybody because we've all got things where reflection could be useful. I think of the education system as a tree that you can get to your level, whatever branch it might be, whether it be get your O-levels, get a practical job, be an electrician, be useful and practical, go and get a degree, maybe you get into marketing, whatever it might be, or do a PhD, do some research. And there's an appropriate level for everybody and where they unfold to in their life. And the good bit of that is we've got this tree of growth of where people want to go to. But unfortunately, what fails, I think, in society for many people is if you fall off the tree, there's nothing to help you keep. Well, there is to some extent, but it can go wrong. And instead of getting the support that people need to stay on the tree and keep growing, unfortunately, in some cases, it can be dropped too far to the ground and end up in prison. And really difficult situations. So I think it would be wonderful to have far more coaches in the world.
Yeah, I would agree, but I'm biased, as you know. And I think also for me, though, that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear philosophy. And it goes back to not the victim of our biography. So O-level lad like yourself, and then nothing else till 30, when I went and did the Open University. So little lad growing up on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, working class family, a totally working class. My mum worked in a mill. My dad worked in a mill originally, then an iron foundry. So the opportunities weren't there back in those days for everybody, depending where you live. But things like the Open University allowed us to climb higher branches, things like later education, the colleges, the technical colleges, gave everybody that chance to, when they were ready, to move in a way that was more effective, more appropriate for them at a time that they were more mature. I'm not quite sure I like the word, but they were ready to be able to benefit from it. And I think one of the problems sometimes with things like university is we encourage children to go there, not because it's the right thing to do, but because they could, they can, we want them to for our benefit, not necessarily theirs.
Yes, it's about government targets too much, isn't it? And I've struggled with the change where polytechnics got all merged into universities, and it's like we want the same status for everybody. We want everybody to be able to go to university, and it's, for me, we want everybody to have opportunities. The types of opportunities is why do we see technical skills as being less valuable than academic skills?
And they're not.
No, all skills are useful, whatever it might be. So I think the problem wasn't that we needed to merge them to make everybody equal. We needed to recognize the fundamental equalness of everybody's skills, regardless of what we called them.
Definitely.
And we lost that focus on technical skills that polytechnics did to some extent. I know they obviously still do more of those, and the old university, there's still a split between, I don't know what's the right terms, but you talk about the red brick and the old classic universities.
But it's like at the moment I'm heavily involved in a modern commercial university as one of their coach mentors, and I'm helping people on a coaching apprenticeship, a level 5 coaching apprenticeship. But the whole apprenticeship is designed for 16 to 18-year-olds, not for 30-plus-year-olds. And it's about fitting in with government regulations that are designed literally for people leaving school. So they've got to show they've got a no level in English and mathematics. And even if they've got a PhD and they can't find their GCSE O-level results, they've got to retake English and or mathematics, because the tick box says, do you have your qualification at this level? Yes, go away and carry on the course. No, prove that you've got it. You might be a 60-year-old professor at a university, as some of mine are. You've still got to go back and do English and maths at a GCSE level. And you go, why? What value does that add? And it's about making the measure important. I'm finding that fascinating.
I can take this back into terms of different value systems and worldviews.
You could, yeah.
Because there's truth in both sides. We don't want people coming in and doing those courses that haven't got the capacity to do them. So we need something to say, how do we guard to get the right people in here that's going to be good for them, and we're not going to waste each other's time. So that goes back to, and the example I always give in terms of the levels, in fact, I should mention a book that I'm listening to on Audible at the moment called The Listening Society. Hansi, I've forgotten the name now, but The Listening Society, Hansi, I think you'd find it from that if you Googled it, which talks about all these different kinds of things. And he has different names for the levels. But if you imagine that terrible twos toddler, if we go back to the Wild West, I think of the gunslingers as a bit like that. They're just doing whatever they please, and there's chaos around, and they're stealing cattle and doing all sorts of things. And then the poor townspeople trying to get a living, trying to grow some crops, do all these kind of things, being harassed. What comes about is that the town says, we need a sheriff.
Yeah.
We've got to put some rules in place.
Yeah.
In a nursery, that's the teacher comes along and says, no, stop doing that. You've got to learn to respect and play together nicely. So we need the rules to curb the excesses of the individual ego, Freudian self starting to believe in itself, and I can do whatever I want. And we can start to then balance it all out to grow up into a society where we all look after each other.
And that's the move from an organic business to a bureaucratic business. The bureaucracy comes in when you need to put rules in place to give you reliability and validity, moving straight back to the beginning of the conversation, so that you can consistently give the service that you need to give, both to your customers and your employees. So yeah, it's a classic organizational growth and development model as well.
So it's really important that we put rules in place, because we don't want that excessive bullying, whatever it might be, disorganized stuff, etc. And the thing that happens in these stages, as individuals play their parts in bigger groups or societies, is that those rules start to come in, or at the different levels, a new set of behaviors start to come in, and ways of organizing that curb the problems of the simpler worldview below it. And it makes sense, because what we're doing is we're solving those problems. But over time, people forget that the reason we've got rules is to curb those excesses.
Yeah.
And they get into the habit of rules are good.
Yeah.
And they put more and more rules in place, and people forget why the rules were there in the first place.
Yeah, very
It's
much so.
very easy for many people that like the detail and structure, because of course other people want chaos and whatever, but the people that like to start putting more and more rules in place, will put a rule in place because that one person did something that didn't make sense. They didn't get a receipt. We now make it compulsory. If you don't get your receipt, you don't get your money.
Yeah.
It becomes more and more bureaucratic over time. And eventually people start to say, oh, I've had enough of being in IBM. Nobody got fired for buying IBM. Well, yeah, but that was also a problem in the long term, because there were new kinds of computers and new kinds of business, and change started as people broke out of that and started to have a new set of rules about, actually, no, we need agile businesses. We need people that are entrepreneurs, make lots of money quickly and do all these things. And we use science to test, as I was saying, split test those results to make it go as efficiently as possible. And we then start to lose what was good in the smaller businesses, which were the family values, we care about each other and all those kind of things, if we take that level to the extreme. And of course, the ultimate was the banking crisis, where they've lost connection with not just customers, but the whole of what society is about if we're not careful.
Very much so. And the classic comment, was it Fred the Shred? It's time people forgot or stopped this witch hunt. Well, no, people are still losing everything. It isn't time. It's time you stop being arrogant, unquote, of some of the responses. And it reminds me, again, back when I was doing a lot of customer focus work, I was down at a customer conference in Microsoft's offices in Reading, a one-day conference down there, and they had, I'm sure this was the conference, they had a guy from Marks and Spencer's there, and he was telling the story, and he's saying, if we go back before we had cash machines and holes in the walls, Marks and Spencer's was the biggest clearing bank in Europe on a Saturday, because if you didn't get to the bank on Friday to get your money out, you had none for the weekend. So what people would do is they'd go into Marks and Spencer's, they'd buy something, and depending on how brass-necked they were, they would either go and pay by check, they would either go straight to the returns, take it back and get cash back, or they'd come back an hour or two later, take it to returns and get cash back. And that cash then funded them going out on a Saturday night. And the representative was saying, and we regularly get challenged on this. Do you know, are you not, shouldn't you be having a rule or putting something in place to stop that? And they said, what we said was, we got a big flip chart and we went with a pen and just put a little dot on it and said, if you think about this flip chart, is Marks and Spencer's is customer base, that dot is the size of the problem. Are you saying we should put a rule in place just to cover that dot and then disenfranchise the rest of the population? Which I thought was really an interesting and important lesson around, again, making the measure important and not having rules for rules' sake, but having practical rules that benefit both the organisation and the customer.
And that's actually, if you start listening to what some of the complexity people talk about and emergent behaviours, really important, because you can look at that from a simple business point of view and say, oh, what, we're lending people money. That's a bad idea. We're losing profit. Let's stop it. But from a much bigger, it's actually a social service for those people. If Marks and Spencer can afford it, and obviously from a business point of view, it might be bad and you might not be able to do it nowadays. But in that world, it actually helped society to function.
Yeah.
And you could literally, as you say, disenfranchise a lot of people by stopping that. And the flip side of that is you're getting incredible support from the community that Marks and Spencer's play this role within society. From a lot of people. I mean, some people might frown on it. It's complex.
Yeah.
But to just put a rule in place and say we're doing it for this simple reason, you know, the complexity people are saying there's much more going on.
Yeah.
And in fact, that leads through into all of those people that got into starting new businesses, being entrepreneurial. It's all about profit. It's good. It's making society work. We're inventing new things. But there was an emergent behavior that people didn't realize was we're starting to warm the planet up because we've got this unchecked machine for chopping all the trees down. And another emergent property was that people said, oh, let's have biofuels because that's much more natural and it's replaceable because it's better than burning oil and making CO2. But the emergent behavior that people haven't quite realized is that if you give people an opportunity to grow biofuel in some parts of the world, that's relatively lucrative and they can do quite well. So what they do, they start chopping the rainforest down.
Yeah.
To plant more.
Yeah.
So the idea was to be more environmentally friendly, and actually it ends up being environmentally damaging. So these things are really complex. So we need a faster way of exploring. We need to test things, see what emerges, learn and grow. So it's like in a business. People would talk about what's your 10-year business plan. You can't have a 10-year business plan as a business now because the world will be very different in 10 years' time. So you need I've got Simon Sinek wise, this is my why. This is how I think I'll do it. And this is what I'm doing. The why shouldn't change. I'm doing this because I believe in helping humanity, or I'm helping older people to have a better life, whether I'm building wheelchairs for them or whatever it might be. So the why is something that should be relatively consistent. The what might move a bit, but the details, you need to be able to change and be agile. As other companies compete and the world changes, or perhaps the robots come, and people don't need the same systems anymore. It's very different. So we're living in a much more complex world because of the societies we've created. And
the speed of change is shortening.
And if you look at the jobs that are going to go extinct over the next 20 or 30 years, I was going to say in a good case and a worse case, but it's very hard to separate because both sides are good and bad. It's good that we get to the point where computers and robots can do the menial jobs that people don't enjoy, but it's bad the process we have to go through to get to that position. And it's also a very big social challenge as to how well we manage that. And do we end up with a utopia, in quotes, obviously not in an absolute sense, but a nice world where everybody's got some money and resources and a comfortable life and the resources are being shared? Or is it a dystopia where the 10 richest people in the world own all the robots and get all of the money, and most other people have got less and less, and we've got social unrest and all sorts of chaos? So that's one of the reasons why potentialization is here, to say, I mean, there was a literal turning point for me at one point where it was, what do I do to help? There are lots of problems in the world and lots of good people with good skills, whether it be degrees, practical skills, helping people in charities, all sorts of different things that are making a difference. And I can't fix all of those problems, obviously. Nobody can. Everybody is contributing. Lots of people are contributing in lots of ways. But if I take my fascination with philosophy, psychology, sociology, biodynamics, all that kind of stuff, and combine it with my software experience, if I can help to initiate, because I can't even build it, I'm too old. My software skills are old-fashioned PC skills, and nowadays you need full stack, front end, back end, database, all sorts of things to make it work. And Google Cloud or Amazon, whatever it might be, a huge host of skills to make something work. But if I can initiate the building of, shall we say, in a way that's good for society, which is why it's a non-profit, because we don't want this to be something that can be worth a lot of money and sold to the highest bidder for the highest profit. It's hopefully for the good of as many people as possible. If a lot of people in the world get a little bit more aware, especially when they're younger, I mean, imagine that a teacher in Africa or India or wherever it might be takes a few teenagers and says, oh, jump on this platform, try this out. Oh, look, we've learned a little bit about these different personalities. If we can do that with people in school or at whatever stage as early as possible, so that where you're coaching and you work with a group of high-level management, and for the first time you see them say, that explains.
Mm.
And they're in the 40s or 50s or whatever, and it's like,
Yeah.
imagine if they could have been that aware and started on a path much younger, or wherever is best.
Yeah.
So we can get as many people to be a little bit more aware of self-aware and relationship aware and all those different things as soon as possible. It's really important for me that we don't say that potentialization is the answer to all those things and it teaches people all those things. It's more of a clearinghouse that will get people interested. It's a catalyst to say, learn a little bit, but you might want to go off and learn more about Myers-Briggs or Big Five or whatever else. You might want to,
here's where you can.
And we start that process off, especially given the chaos of where we're at in the world at the moment, and the ever-growing challenges and the way that the things that people will face in the future.
Definitely. Is that a nice link then to show what potentialization looks like today? Fascinating backstory that hopefully has given everybody watching this some things to go away and think about. Some of the books that you've talked about, I'll certainly look up some of them, as well as some of the other models that we've just bandied around as if we know what we're talking about, let alone anybody else. So is this maybe the time to have a look at where you're at today then, Jon, with potentialization?
It is, but I'm also really aware that we've just done nearly 2 hours, which is amazing, because I've really enjoyed that time. So, do you know, I think we're going to have to book another session to go.
I do as well. That was my thoughts, I've got to say. It's almost part one, isn't it? And leave people ready to see part two.
But it might be useful to say what the system is, just in very broad terms, for a couple of minutes. And then we can go through and look at where we're up to. In
a trailer or a taster.
So one of the key principles for me is that apart from being, in quotes, this word teacherly, we want it to be something that offers people the choice, the opportunity to learn a bit more wherever they might want to go. It's not about imposing anything on anybody. And it's not about saying which views are right or wrong. It's how do I learn those critical thinking skills? How do I get more awareness? So it's at its core, it's what you might call, but we want it to go way beyond this, a psychological instrument engine.
Okay.
People take surveys, whether it be a Big Five, Jungian, highly sensitive people, stage development, as many of these different models as possible, but we'll probably, based on resources and when we've got the capacity to do this, start building in what they call gamification stuff, so that people can go on an app and play a game, and that's kind of the psychological instrument. Because we'll start off with a survey engine that uses classic text answers, but of course people talk about how that goes through certain bits of the brain, and that gets filtered and all sorts of things. Perhaps games get more directly at some elements. So there's this core psychological engine to say, let's build a map of you together with them choosing to take tests, whether it be with a coach or that can interpret it and give them more value and more understanding, or even if they come in with a friend says have a go, or a teacher says have a, perhaps to a teenager or whatever, learn a bit more about yourself. But what we then want to do is say, using a machine learning artificial intelligence engine, people a bit like you, and of course this is suggestions, it's not telling people what to do, people that have got this particular personality trait of openness perhaps, particular that have got this level of complexity thinking, particularly enjoyed this website or this YouTube video or whatever, you might find that interesting. And we want to take that a little bit further with something that I'd call learning paths, to say, if you want to know more about spiral dynamics or Maslow or attachment theory or whatever, it might be a student comes into the system and says, oh, I've got an idea about what might be really useful to learn about attachment theory. We've got a video here of somebody I really like. We've got a document here that describes it a little bit more. And then we can put a survey at the end so you can test yourself and see how you're doing. And then afterwards, we might recommend you go off and do something else.
Mm.
So we've got lots of routes through the system where we're actually hoping, teacherly wise, in the same way, partially a good teacher would say, "Oh, that kid's doing really well. I'm going to teach them about negative numbers, even though the rest of the class aren't there yet,
Yeah.
because I know they're hungry for more."
Yeah.
So the system is trying to be teacherly in the sense of offering what could be good for them next, and to put them in contact with.
It's almost self-directed learning, isn't it?
Yeah.
With, I suppose, with surveys as part of the guidance for the self-direction. I like it. I like it. It works for me.
But I think we have to always be careful that it doesn't become that we're telling people what, and it becomes you only stay in the system. You want to have real coaches around the back.
Yeah.
And real people to go and learn more from the subtleties, because the computer system is going to be somewhat dead, or void of humanity in some sense, and it mustn't ever become the machine that says where somebody's up to in the world without relationship. It wants to be a computer aided teaching and not descriptive, proscriptive.
Computer supported, not computer driven.
Yes. So yes, I think, if you're up for it, let's have another session. The bit that we've built so far that I was going to describe, but I think you're absolutely right, it'd be better in a separate session, is the survey engine is working now.
Excellent.
So you can build a survey, whether it be a big five or whatever, by putting a set of questions in, doing some calculations and getting a report out. We'll go through it all in detail. But the next stage is going to be sending a survey out. So if you're a coach, you could send it out to your 10 people or 10 managers. And they all fill it in and you get the results back. And it's a bit more of the administrative bit. Or as an individual, you can come in and have a look through and say, "Oh, I fancy doing that one." The engine's there. And the next bit over the next 2-3 months is we'll have a minimal viable product to make it more accessible. So
and I can see an immediate use for that as a coach in some ways, with 360-degree feedback, or going out, and I've done that, which is quite labour intensive, with senior execs I've coached, where I've got the company and their customers to complete it. So it's nice that we can automate that in a way that adds value.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things about it is it's a non-profit. So what I want is a whole community. We've created, and there's nothing in it yet, but we've created there's a website called Tribe. There's lots of different ones, but I've used one called Tribe, where people can join, and it's a community place. So what I'd love to happen over the next few months and years is more and more people become part of our tribe and contribute. So we might have somebody in another country, wherever in the world, invents a new kind of psychological test and says, "I want to give this to the world." They can come and put it into the system.
And my change curve, I was just lucky. I met Alan Chapman at the right time, who said, "Can I put this on my website, John?" And I said, yes. And as you know, my curve's got a life of its own, and constantly come across people who know the curve, and you just think, how, where? So, as you know, I'm fully supportive of the whole philosophy that you're building potentialisation on. Wouldn't be here now if I wasn't.
And I think from my point of view, but hopefully to build a better system, I think that principle is really important, that you gave something away in terms of saying, yes, anybody can use this change curve, but I would guess it bought you business.
One would hope so. And I have made a slight money, I'm talking pennies, not pounds, from some commercial uses of it. And I've got a few books free where they put it in the book. So I've got the book that it's on page 52, and that's it. So it's brought me intangible benefits, and it's brought me a lot of satisfaction in people have found it useful.
I think together, collectively, we have to look after ourselves and make sure we've got money to live on and stuff, and not give our whole lives away. We need to earn income, but I think collectively we can do better than we can outright competitively all the time.
Synergy, definitely. And it's all about cooperation. definitely.
So
I
thank
suppose
you
on
for
that,
thank you for your cooperation and doing this talk.
I've loved it. It's been fascinating, John, and hopefully everybody watching this will be as intrigued as I am now to see part 2 of this when we can get that organised.
Yeah.